We're good on.
Get started.
Mhm.
Let's do it.
Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first interview in our Free the Fresno Elephants Zoom interview series. And we're so lucky and excited to have Dr. Keith Lindsay joining us here today. Most of you probably know me, but I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Courtney Fern. I'm the NhRP's Director of Government Relations and Campaigns, and I am zooming in from California. And we're, like I said, so honored to have Dr. Keith Lindsay. I'm going to read a little bit of his bio and then turn it over to him to give a brief introduction, because I'm sure I'm not going to be able to cover the extent of his work and his expertise in elephants. But here we go. Dr. Keith Lindsay is a biologist with more than 30 years of experience in elephant research and conservation. Dr. Lindsay's work began in 1977 in Kenya's Amboseli National Park, the top place in Africa to get close to free-ranging elephants. There, he began researching wild elephants with Amboseli Trust for Elephants, now the longest-running study of elephant behavior in the wild. From then on, Dr. Lindsay's professional work with elephants expanded to other parts of Africa, Asia, and North America. And Dr. Lindsay is also an expert in our case on behalf of elephants Amale, Nalwazi, and Vasmusi, who are imprisoned at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. So I will turn it over to Keith to give maybe a brief overview of his work with elephants, and maybe also touch upon what piqued his interest in elephants and how he got into research.
Thank you, Courtney, for the opportunity to talk to you and to so many people. It's great to see the participation. Yeah, an interest in the elephants. My interest in elephants, I mean, I was very lucky back in the late 70s. So there you go. That gives you a hint of my longevity. I was backpacking across Africa, but I had some contact details of some people in Kenya, and they led me to a gentleman called Harvey Crows and Cynthia Moss, who were starting a study at that time. They were a few years into it, getting going, and I was really in the ground floor of their project, and it was to study. They had this vision of studying elephants using recognition files of all the elephants in the population. It had been started before in Tanzania by a man called Ian Douglas Hamilton, and he's gone on to found an organization called Save the Elephants, which is also working in Kenya. But he had to leave Tanzania and his work was interrupted, whereas Cynthia Moss particularly started this project in Amboseli, and she did it there because it's a small park in the southern part of Kenya, just across the border from the Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and that watershed feeds the ecosystem. It provides all the water for the springs that come out, and that's the source of the water for the whole system of grazing animals, including elephants. It was quite a well-used park, and for that reason the elephants were very used to people in vehicles, and there was also a small number of about 400, and so that allowed them to quickly photograph them, and they discovered that the ears of the elephants were very easily distinguishable, with the nicks and tears and things on the sides, and also that once you've got a few family members, you could then figure out the rest of them. So they assembled a catalog of photographic file of the elephants at that time and all the babies, and they gave them names from a baby book. Yeah, I was involved from quite early on. They were studying social behavior. The interest there was mainly the society of elephants, and so there was a niche for me to study the feeding ecology and foraging of the elephants, and so that's what I got involved in, and I did that for a master's in Canada, and then where I'm from, and then I was able to do a PhD in Cambridge in UK on the same subject, and that ended around the mid-80s, the actual field work. But then I've remained in contact with the project ever since, and have been on and off involved in supervising and helping design research and keeping the research going. And it's been going ever since then. As Courtney mentioned, the longest running study now. And so now there's just shy of 2,000 elephants there. All the births and deaths have been recorded to within a month of occurrence, certainly the births. So that means that the genealogies of all the elephants in the whole population are known. The other thing is that because they're so habituated to people, they're really easy to observe. And so you could quickly, from my perspective, watch every item that they fed on, but also where they went. And people studying the social behavior were able to find out incredible, intricate details of their social behavior. And it quickly became clear that these are amazing animals. And so for the sort of technical reasons of why it was a great place to study elephants, it became for me a kind of a lifelong passion, because they're clearly highly intelligent, powerful, but yet incredibly gentle with each other, and very tolerant of people, despite the conflicts they sometimes get into. But they're just wonderful animals. So I have remained in contact with the project, and yeah, that was a long time ago now. It's in its 50th year. I wasn't involved quite that long, but certainly over 40 years now. And but then subsequently, I went on to do work in other parts of Africa on humans' relations with wildlife in general, and different species of wildlife, but keeping the focus on elephants. And then in the past few years, I've gotten involved with elephants in captivity, and I've done a number of statements and comments on captive elephants in different situations in zoos, mostly in North America. I did a survey of these elephants in zoos in Japan a few years ago. And then I've also been involved in elephants in relation to their international trade in live elephants to zoos, but also the ivory trade. So that's pretty much it. Sorry for going on, but there it goes.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like you've been doing much. So, but that's amazing. All the work that you've done. And yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned elephants in Japan, because the welfare assessment, if anyone's interested, we could send around a link. It was incredible. And what's the solitary elephants there, and the sort of barren environments that they're kept in. It's really outrageous. And what you put together and what you worked on with Ulara was great. And I encourage anyone to follow them as well. But let's talk a bit about what you learned about who elephants are during your study or during your research, and just your work on behalf of elephants. I was wondering if you could give maybe a brief overview. And I know it's easier said, you can't really say what's a typical day of an elephant, because it likely probably depends on where they are in their lives, their age, if there's some sort of conflict going on. But a lot of our work, we talk about, how the zoos don't meet the needs of the elephants. So before going into that, I thought it might be good to go over like a very standard day of an adult female and an adult male African elephant, if you
Okay.
don't mind.
Thanks again.
In the wild.
In the wild. Yeah, I must say, I apologize in advance if I tend to go on and on, but once I get started talking about elephants, it's hard to get me to stop. I'll try to be brief. A typical day for an elephant, I mean, as you said, there aren't really typical days, they're all different in the wild, but the basic characteristics are that being the largest land animal, really, African elephants, possibly, well, apart from dinosaurs, certainly the largest existing mammal animals, and they're herbivores, so they have to get all their food from plants, and that means that they have to spend a lot of time feeding. And most of the plants out in the environment are not high quality. The plant material, there's lots of fruits and things here and there, but mostly it's low quality food. So they have to make a living by finding large amounts of food. That means they spend something like 3/4 of their time in the 24 hours feeding. And when I studied them, I had plenty of time to do my work. In fact, I did a few follows over 24 hours, and they are feeding actively during the night and during the daytime. So that's what they do. Most of the time, they're feeding on different kinds of plants, mostly grasses when available, because they're easy to get and they can feed large amounts, but if it's good enough quality. But they also eat a whole range of other plants. In fact, just about everything. They eat the roots of trees. They certainly will find fruits if they can. They love fruits, especially forest elephants. But they aren't very abundant, so they'll eat flowers, they'll eat vines, they'll pull them down. They eat everything basically in the wild. And so they have a huge varied diet, and they spend a lot of time feeding. The rest of their day, they spend a few hours usually in the middle of the day, heat of the day, sleeping, often standing up when they're adults. At night, they spend a couple or more hours sleeping, lying down, right on their sides, snoring away. It's quite hard to keep awake when you're surrounded by elephants snoring. But then they lurch to their feet and start again with feeding. The other things they do, they take care of their bodies by wallowing, by dusting, scratching. They use branches as fly whisks and to remove ticks and things. They drink once a day generally. They're on the move all the time basically, and they move slowly when feeding, steadily across grass, but then when they're moving between feeding areas, they move purposefully, great long strides, and they do that every day as well. And there's usually a period in the morning and the evening when they go walking. And then when they're not doing all these other things, they spend, so most of the time they're doing these other things, and they spend time socializing. And indeed, when they're feeding, they're also interacting and talking to each other all the time. But then when they're actively socializing, they touch each other, they are friendly to each other. They sometimes are aggressive to strangers. So that's the kind of general picture of the life. Now, females, they have a whole suite of behaviors that are specific to females. And the females live with other generally related females. So they stay together with their sisters and their mothers and their aunts, and all these related females stay together for their whole lives until the groups get very large. And then they split up along kind of lines of mother and offspring. That's savanna elephants. Forest elephants and Asian elephants tend to have smaller groups and mostly just mothers and immediate offspring. But they spend a lot of time taking care of calves, and older animals that are not yet having their own calves can take care of the babies as well, and that's called allo mothering. So they learn mothering skills by play mothering. Play, I mentioned play, they play a lot, especially the babies, the calves. And so there's all sorts of activity like that going on within the group. They can join into bigger aggregations of families, and there are related families. They communicate a lot to each other through low frequency sound and even seismic. They can pick up vibrations that carry under the ground or along the ground for some distance. And studies that in Amboseli and other places have shown that they are able to recognize individually the calls of over 100 different elephants. So they know a lot about the other animals in their groups and they share the ecosystem with. They also know a huge amount about where food is found, and their spatial memory is enormous. The part of their brain that's associated with spatial memory, the cerebellum, is enormous, as is the motor area of their brain, where used for the trunk. It controls the trunk with all its different muscles. It's a hand, as well as a smelling and tasting organ all at once. And so they use that in their feeding. All these different kinds of food that they find. The males will start separating from their mom at a very early age, even when they're a calf. The boys play away from the girls and away from their family more. But by the time they're in their teens, they really start moving away from the family entirely. And when they join other groups, they spend time with other animals. And then eventually they leave the family entirely and they spend their time with males, other males, and the males that have a separate life from females. But they continue to associate with females from time to time, with family groups. And it's known that young males from a family will come back to their own family, be greeted. They know who that guy is. And he knows who they are, and then they go off again. And then when they're very old, the biggest bulls don't spend much time with the females at all, unless they're interested in mating. And then there's that whole side of mating that they do as well, searching for mates and competing. And so the life that they lead is extremely rich, very social, very on the move all the time, covering large distances, large areas, seasonally changing all the time. It's constantly dynamic, and it's fascinating.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it makes me sad hearing about that, because the aspect of the work we do is working on behalf of elephants who are deprived of the ability to engage in any of that behavior you just described and confined to small, barren, zoo exhibits that maybe at most are, 4 or 5 acres that they have to share with other elephants. So sort of getting to that, US zoos, and I know that's also a general term because some zoo exhibits vary, but generally they claim that they can meet the physical and psychological needs of elephants. And I'm curious what you think of that claim based on the zoo's exhibits that you've seen here in the United States.
Well, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to learn that I don't think that they're anything like what an elephant needs. And it's not just the zoos I've seen, and I've seen some pretty terrible zoos, as well as some that are supposed to be better zoos. And that's a term that's often used, better zoos. And then there's the whole question of the standards, that the AZA, American Zoo Association, has standards for elephants, and other zoo associations in Europe and elsewhere have standards, and they're minimum standards, and they're on the level of a few 100 square meters. They have one thing. There are the compounds, but there are the stalls where they're kept. Often, just about every zoo keeps their elephants in at night in the stall, and in places where the weather's cold, they keep them in there 24 hours. So that's just an area that's slightly larger than the elephant. It's like a shoebox that's a bit on the loose side for the shoe. The outdoor areas, yeah, just a few acres. I mentioned that the elephants cover large areas. We're talking tens of thousands of square kilometers in some cases, certainly hundreds. In Asian elephants and forest elephants, the ranges might be smaller, but it's still hundreds of square kilometers or miles for American audience. But we're talking vastly higher orders of magnitude area. So yeah, the zoo exhibits are completely undersized for an animal like an elephant, but also barren in general terms, partly because they have to keep them clean, but also elephants just walking around a place, and you see a zoo exhibit that's been prepared for elephants and it's covered with lush grass. And as soon as elephants spend any time at all in there, there's no more grass. So they're generally barren and uninteresting and unstimulating for their minds and also their bodies. They don't get any exercise, so their muscle tone is, suffers greatly. But I may be jumping ahead in terms of
Yeah. Oh, no, that's totally fine. No, something you mentioned, and we'll go into it later, but you talked about how the males, once they separate off from the females, or the female herds, they'll often come back to their familial herd and, say hello or socialize. And it makes me think of a smoothie who's, and I know this is probably maybe like completely unrelated, but his mother is in San Diego, which is only a couple hundred miles from him. So hypothetically, say he was free ranging in California, which we know is not possible. It's sad to think that, both of them are imprisoned at different zoos. His mom's at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. He's at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. But, if he was allowed, he could go and visit her, and his brother's down there. It's just, I don't know, just what's happening is, it's so sad, and unnecessary. And I wanted to also talk about the difference between zoos and sanctuaries, because one of the things in our cases we argue, obviously for the elephants to have the right to liberty recognized, and for them to be sent to an accredited elephant sanctuary where they can live as freely as possible, and enjoy their autonomy to the greatest extent possible. Sometimes the zoos will say, well, sanctuaries are just another form of captivity, which they are, but they're very different. The sanctuaries that you've visited, what's the difference that you've seen between zoos and sanctuaries? And what do you think the quality of life is, the difference of quality of life for the elephants who are imprisoned at zoos versus living freely at a sanctuary, say like Paws or the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee?
Well, I think jumping back a little bit to your previous question, do zoos provide for the physical needs of elephants? They don't, in any sense, because they can't move around, and they can't exercise. And I think that's one of the major differences between zoos and sanctuaries is the scale. Sanctuaries are 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. Generally, the compounds that elephants have are much larger than a zoo exhibit. And one must stress that the places where elephants are kept in zoos are exhibits for public viewing. So there's a couple of things about sanctuaries. One is what you can see, and that is that they're generally larger, much larger. They have varied habitat. They have natural grass that elephants can graze and pluck themselves. They have trees, ponds, hills. They have terrain where elephants can actually use their muscles to walk on, and they have enough space to walk straight line distances at different times of day. So one aspect is the size and also the variety of the habitat that the sanctuaries have. They offer so much more physically for elephants, but also for their minds. They can choose to forage on different food types, and they, according to their own terms. And they, as I mentioned, they spend so much of their time feeding. That's really important part of an elephant's life. So the other thing, though, is what you don't see, and that is the philosophy of sanctuaries is to give elephants agency, to allow them to make choices, their own choices about what to do with their time. The best sanctuaries don't prescribe what elephants should do at any given time. They allow them to come in and out of barns. They allow them to associate with whom they like within, disease control restrictions. The other thing is that just about every sanctuary person I've talked to is humble about what they offer. They all admit that it's still not good enough. They're still not giving the elephants what they really need, which is the freedom to move across ecosystems and just to associate with other individuals as they choose, to have families, those sorts of things. By definition, sanctuaries are places where elephants go to end their lives, not to breed and create more elephants. You don't find that humility in zoos.
Yeah. Yeah. to say the least, put it nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for describing that. And you put it so much more eloquently than I could have. I've only had the pleasure of visiting one of the elephant sanctuaries in the US, and that was Paws, and I was taken aback by how much, one, I only saw the elephants that chose to come up to the area where guests are. There was no, bringing them to us. And, they're not open to the public. So it's, just the 1 or 2 open houses a day, and just the amount of space that they had, the social opportunities, and like you said, freedom of choice. They can, if they want to go sleep in the barn, they can go sleep in the barn. If they want to forage all night or, sleep outside, they can sleep outside. I know that's true of all the sanctuaries in the US, the elephant sanctuaries. So it's really great that the elephants have an opportunity, those that are held captive here, to go to a sanctuary, and that meets their needs to the greatest extent possible. So I wanted to talk a bit, and I do want to get to, I know, to talk about the Fresno Chaffee Zoo elephants, but, one of the areas that you work on are threats that are facing elephants, and, aiding with their conservation in their natural habitat. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk briefly about the threats that are currently facing elephants, maybe specifically on the African continent.
Okay. Well, I mean, there are two types of threats that the elephants face, both from people, and that is one is the fast-acting, devastating effect of the ivory trade, and illegal hunting of elephants. Fast-acting because elephants can be killed in large numbers very quickly. Population can be even wiped out. Within a very short period of time, but it also can be switched off, if you like, relatively quickly. And that's part of the work I'm involved with, is with international trade in elephants. And most countries in Africa have clearly recognized that killing elephants for their ivory or selling their ivory is wrong. There are a few countries in Southern Africa that have the mistaken idea, in my opinion, that selling ivory raises money for conservation and it can be used to help elephants, but it really only adds to the demand. And the demand used to be huge in Europe during the colonial period, and the ivory trade was closely associated with the slave trade. So the history of the ivory trade is a dark one for elephants and people. The international trade in ivory was allowed until the mid to late 80s, and the idea was that it could be controlled with licensing and paperwork, but that it wasn't possible to control it, and a huge illegal trade kind of went alongside that. That was banned in '89 and enacted later on, a couple of years later. And apart from this, they say these 3-4 countries in Southern Africa who want to trade, there hasn't been any trade in ivory, legal trade. And that's made a huge difference to the rate of poaching. Well, it would have done if these countries hadn't persisted. And so they insisted on a couple of one-off sales of their stockpiles, and that stimulated the trade again. But now it's gradually coming down, and it's also being taken seriously. Wildlife trade was a kind of unrecognized international illegal activity, but looking at the numbers now, the international criminal syndicates, the smuggling of goods is the number one is drugs, I believe. Second is guns. I think human trafficking is up there, and then wildlife, illegal wildlife trade is third or fourth, with the same criminal syndicates. So they, the same bad guys have networks that stretch down to the grassroots, and people at the grassroots, just poor villagers, can kill elephants, and then the ivory gets up through smugglers to international markets. But it's now being taken seriously by the UN. The UN Agency on Drugs and Crime is also looking at illegal trade. So we're starting to turn the corner on that. But the longer term, slower but more persistent threat to elephants is the competition for land and with people. And growing populations need land, and they're converting land to agriculture in places that elephants lived without any difficulty. And so the human-elephant conflict is growing, and it's reducing the options for elephants to live in landscapes they used to live in. They're killed in retaliation for stealing crops, but also they're just pushed off the land. There are parks, but they're only a small fraction of the landscape that elephants need to exist in. And I mean, one of the amazing things about elephants is that they know all this. They know where it's dangerous for either poachers or but with people who can kill them, chase them off land. And they know where there are corridors that are still safe corridors, and so they change their behavior and follow those corridors and manage to get from place to place. So and they're able to do that if people give them the opportunity. But yeah, those threats, that's the bigger, ultimately the worst threat to elephants.
Yeah. What can be done to, in your opinion, help protect elephants in their natural habitat?
Well, I painted a pretty dismal picture about the future for elephants. And the amazing thing is, and partly Asia is an example of how things could go. The Asian elephant has persisted in the subcontinent, Asia, India, Sri Lanka, down into Southeast Asia, despite the fact that human densities are so high. And partly a lot of it's got to do with cultural tolerance of elephants. Unfortunately, the god Ganesh is an elephant, and elephants are used in religious ceremonies, and that's not a good thing, but it does mean that there's a certain respect for elephants, and that's allowed them to persist. But the pressures on elephants in Asia are still high and are continuing. In Africa, there's 10 times as many elephants as in Asia, and the areas that they're facing are less constrained. But there are there's cultural reverence for elephants in Africa as well. So I think that that's one of the saving graces. And I think that what people are doing, both in Asia and in Africa, is finding ways for elephants and people to coexist. And it's difficult. I mean, if you're just trying to grow some fruit or veg in your garden, and animals come and take it, raccoons come and take you're not happy, and you want to do something about that animal. So farmers wanting to keep elephants out of their crops are fully justified in doing that. But there are ways to work with farmers with wildlife compatible agriculture, growing, using crops that growing seasons are different. Fences for keeping elephants out of fields that use beehives, because elephants, although they're enormous, really don't like getting stung by bees. So people have found that if they string up beehives along the fences and the bees are disturbed, they'll come out and the elephants will turn away. They don't like chili pepper, so people have found that they can put chili pepper fences or grow chili pepper along their field and keep elephants out. And actually, with the beehives, there's the additional value of honey that farmers can use as a cash crop. And so people are working on these things, and in areas where they share the landscape, people and elephants share the landscape, they're doing things like zoning, and so that this is a corridor for elephants. And so people are not supposed to farm there. The government in Botswana has done this. And there's a good group there, a couple of groups there working on coexistence between elephants and farmers. And I was involved in a project in Myanmar, which was also trialed in Sri Lanka, and then now they're talking about doing it in Assam, where they use electric fences, the very simple ones that people use for fields keeping sheep in or something. It's just a little single strand of often plastic, in the wire and with a car battery. And elephants don't like getting shocked by that. But the great thing is that people, if they break the fence, people can just fix it very quickly. And they take ownership of that process. The local farmers do. And then when the crops are harvested, they take it down and they put it around the feed store. And that means the elephants can use the land. And these things are happening and they're being replicated. So I think from that side, I think there's room for hope. And I think, as I mentioned, the ivory trade, there is more and more attention on closing down. The US some years ago down its domestic market for ivory and destroyed the ivory stockpile and persuaded China to do the same. And that was a massive, major diplomatic coup, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
No,
wonderful.
Yeah, it definitely was.
Mm.
So I'm going to skip from this. I was, well, I'll just say it sounds like zoos importing elephants from Africa isn't one of the ways to
No, zoos
save
do
them.
nothing for conservation of elephants. I'll just say it really quickly. The zoos claim that they're all about conservation. This is the zoos finding a reason to exist, because they used to exist because there wasn't television, and documentaries and movies, and that's the only way people could see wildlife. But they have no reason to exist now for that reason, and so they're claiming to do conservation work. And some zoos do a bit of conservation with a bit, funding, and it's people welcome it who are starved for funds in Africa and Asia, but the amounts are small, and they don't need to keep elephants in order to do that work. So many conservation groups do conservation and they don't have any captive animals. It doesn't depend on, and there's no research done in zoos that can't be done better in the wild, and there's nothing that zoos do that benefit wild elephants, and there's no prospect of breeding elephants in zoos and releasing them into the wild. So no, nothing. No good.
Okay. Good. So now we have the expert's opinion on what we've been saying. Yes. Well, thank you for that. And I completely agree. One of the things zoos often say that they're helping conserve the species by their captive breeding program. And, not even if, say, one elephant went back, doesn't justify the suffering of the hundreds that are imprisoned here in the US. There's no prospects of any of the elephants being born in US zoos of ever being sent back to the wild, whether it be to Asia or Africa. And so that aspect of the zoo's propaganda is completely false and not based in any sort of fact. And two of the elephants that are imprisoned at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo were imported from Africa, Eswatini, which was then called Swaziland. And the express intention of the Fresno Zoo is to breed them with Vesmusi. And they claim that somehow is going to help save the species, which we know is not accurate. So let's talk a bit about the Fresno Chaffee Zoo elephants. As I mentioned in the beginning, you submitted an affidavit in support of our petition to have their right to liberty recognized and for them to be free to a sanctuary. And a portion of your affidavit was specifically about, and I know I'm not saying Amboseli's name correctly, but I'm just going to stick with it until I master how to pronounce it. But Amboseli, Nolwazi, and Vesmusi, you viewed their exhibit photos that we've taken, as well as some aerial footage of the exhibit. What would you say life is like for them? I know part of your affidavit mentioned how they can only go 100 yards in any one direction, and as you said earlier, elephants travel great distances during the day and, to find food. And now I'm going to be talking over you, but just, one of the things you say is, well, they don't need to travel because we give them food. But as we, you and many other experts have said, it's not so simple. It's mental stimulation to go find the food. It's physical, helping their physical, meeting their physical needs. But if you could just talk a bit about what, your opinion is on what their life is like currently at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo.
Yeah, I mean, in a word, miserable. Several other words: tedious, boring, repetitive, stressful. They may not look like they're under stress when they're just standing around, but the stress is constant. And one of the things that was really clear to me when I looked at the, I had a look from Google Earth, at the zoo, and urban zoos. First of all, people should never even try to keep large animals in the zoo in a city. I mean, by definition, a large animal needs a large space, and even though you can keep, I mean, people wouldn't keep horses in a tiny stall or a tiny compound. They would consider it appalling to do that. So that is what these elephants have got. And if you, as I say, looking at the zoo from above, it's completely surrounded by light industry and a nightclub on one side, and major roads. There's an interstate running along the western side. There's 4 lanes running along all 4 sides of the zoo, and on the corner of the zoo where the elephant exhibit is, there's not only 2 large roads but a railway line. And I looked into it, and both the major railway lines in California run trains. Railway companies run trains on that line. Video footage I've seen. They're freight trains running past the elephant enclosure every day. I don't know, probably throughout the day and night. So that noise is low frequency and strong. Also, when there are visitors there, screaming people, children, which is fine. I mean, what are they going to do? But they take them to the zoo, kids are shrieking. So they're getting bombarded by low frequency and high frequency noise all day. Well, at least half the day when the people are there and the cars and things. Yeah, and it's flat. It's uninteresting. It's supposedly award-winning, the new exhibit. I looked into that. The architects who designed it have won awards because it looks to visitors like a nice place. There are trees. They've even got antelopes in there, because gazelles. There are fake rock walls. There's a pond. I don't know whether the elephants use it. It didn't look like it in the video clips, but maybe they do. But it's flat. If you break it down, it's flat and uninteresting, and they don't get any cardiovascular. The walking isn't just for amusing themselves. They get cardiovascular support. So their heart and their blood vessels and their muscles and everything. You see the elephants just standing around feeding, and it's horrible.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the beginning when you're talking about the lives of elephants, so we tried to sort of condense it. What would a day be like? You mentioned that every day is different. It really depends. And as you said, their days are the same. They know what's coming every day. And what kind of psychological stress, would you imagine that places on them? Sort of like what you said, they're quietly suffering. You might not see it. Some of the footage we've seen, I think it's the youngest female elephant has been exhibiting stereotypic behavior like rocking. But if you could just talk a little bit about the stuff, whether it be I know you just talked about the physical and psychological suffering they're enduring at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo.
Well, I mean, the stereotypy is the extreme expression of frustration and suffering. And certainly I saw that in all the zoos in Japan I went to. but they were really on the extreme end of deprivation. And there were some that were on some of the zoos in Japan, though, were on the kind of scale that the Fresno Chaffee Zoo is on, where there was natural soil and looked better. The idea that some zoos have they have this term called enrichment, where which is supposedly intended to stimulate the mind, and so this zoo has got some holes in their artificial rock wall, and from the other side they can put food items in there in different holes and things, and so the elephants are supposedly stimulated by this novel challenge. Once they've worked out that that's where the food is, they just go there, do that's done, then they go and do something else. It's just routine. It's not enrichment at all. And if in a sanctuary, elephants don't need enrichment because they get what they need that for their brains from the habitat, from the ecosystem. You see them elephants trying to feed off the grass, and there is grass, but it's so short that they can't even pluck it. They can't grip it. They seem to be getting something off the ground, and either it's grass, little bits of grass from the sward, or probably hay that was dumped there earlier in the day. The fact that they've got gazelles in there is for the visitors to make it look like it's a wild place. Look at the elephants and the gazelles. Gazelles are eating the grass. So there's no way those elephants are going to find any grass because they've got lawnmowers in there with them cutting the grass. It's a stupid idea to put another herbivore in a place where you're expecting elephants to get something. So, and it must be even harder for, I don't know, Amale and Nawazi, because they grew up in the wild, the semi-wild, at least in Eswatini, where they had this kind of seasonal variation in bush and wandering around, and now they were taken from there. They had this terrible experience of being captured, kept in a compound. One of the elephants died before being exported. They were crammed into a cargo plane and all that, brought to the US. The thing that just amazes me about elephants is how forgiving they are. We do this to them. And how can they not want to kill us all the time? But they have been going through all that ordeal, and that will stay with them for years. But they then have to live in this horrible, sterile place. And it must be incredibly hard for them.
Yeah. I can't even imagine what it's like for them.
Yeah.
When I went to the Fresno Chaffee Zoo, I only saw Vesmusi, but he was those on, and Keith, I know you saw it when he was in the sort of caged in training area, just what they make it seem. Maybe it is some sort of like mental stimulation, like the very brief amount that he could get, but it was heartbreaking to see. And I can only imagine what it's like for Amale and Nawazi, having lived, freely for, Amale was for 22 years and, Nawazi 22 years and Amale for 6 or 7. Yeah. I have a couple more questions, but Mickey, do you want to open up the chat box so we can, Keith, would you be able to stay on for 5 minutes extra? Maybe.
Certainly. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I've talked probably over time, but I'll try to keep answers brief.
Okay. Yeah, I have one more question, but Mickey, could we open up the chat so people can start submitting?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you have questions for Keith, please enter them in the chat box and Mickey will ask them in a little bit. But my last question is, why do you believe that Amale, Nawazi, and Vesmusi should be sent to a sanctuary? And I know we've probably already touched on this, but why do you believe they should not stay at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo?
Well, I mean, I think I pretty much said it. They're suffering a lot. They don't deserve to suffer. They've done nothing to deserve this treatment. They're animals that are, I mean, one can distinguish between animals that are, you know, highly intelligent and other ones that aren't. I think they all suffer. I mean, there was a clip of an elephant, of a cheetah in the same zoo, pacing up and down in front of the window. That animal shouldn't be in the zoo either. So yeah, for all the reasons I've said, they need a place where they can. I mean, I think one of the things that the sanctuary people say is that we want elephants to be elephants. And at the moment, they're not elephants. They're just kind of empty shells. So I think that would be my feeling, really.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We agree. And that's why we, you know, are fighting for the recognition of their right to liberty and for them to free to a sanctuary where they can live as freely as possible. And I want to thank you for your expertise and submitting an affidavit on their behalf. But I wanted to open, Mickey, do you want to ask some of the questions? I'll ask one. I see one question just popped up, and I know this was a question we asked Keith about the possibility of elephants in the US being rewilded. And especially I think elephants like the 17 that were brought in 2016, is there a possibility for rewilding and for them to be sent back to their, to a country in Africa that could receive them?
Well, I mean, that's part of, there's two answers, two parts to the question. One is are there places in Africa to send them to? And I mentioned that you know, elephants already living in Africa are facing this big problem of coexistence with people. So space for elephants is shrinking. Bringing more elephants in is quite a tough one. One of the things I kind of touched on with the solution to elephant problems is that the solution is working with communities of people, and bringing elephants in from outside Africa to a place where there are people it has to be handled very diplomatically and sensitively, and it would be hard for a lot of people to understand why that's being done. So there's that challenge. There's a bit of a coda to that. The other one is that that elephants have. There may be a chance for the elephants that originated in Africa to go back to Africa. So the prospects would be better for them. Elephants that have been born in captivity and know nothing but captivity would face a tougher life. It would be quite a learning curve for them. They can't just be turned out into an ecosystem and you can expect them to know what to do, what foods to feed on, how to interact properly with other elephants. So that's a big challenge, and it could take years to rehabilitate elephants to the point where they're able to fend for themselves in a wild ecosystem. And some people have argued that actually would be inhumane to do that. You know, to take them, these elephants that know nothing about food sources, predators. They don't have any immunity to to diseases, to insects biting, you know, all sorts of problems. So in a sense, yeah, it would be very difficult to do. Now they are apparently going to try it in Kenya with some elephants from a zoo in England, and so a lot of people are watching that to see how it goes. And they're doing it in the context of a community area. So the idea is it could even be a bit of a tourist draw to come and see these elephants, and the communities could benefit. But it could also go badly wrong. And so we just don't know at the moment. And it's certainly not something to really consider for for the Fresno Zoo elephants, I don't think. Not right now, anyway.
Yeah. And I think it just highlights too, what you said earlier, like there's no conservation, like the zoos here by breeding them and and importing are just creating a problem because there's no way to, there's no place to send them back to. And it's just sort of debilitating them so that they have to stay here in the US. And like you said, while sanctuaries are great, the wild is always the best.
Wild is the best for wild elephants.
For wild elephants, yes.
But for elephants who've grown up in captivity, probably sanctuaries are the best for them.
Yeah.
But with the nature of sanctuaries is that they have a commitment for the life of the elephant, which can be, when one wants it to be, many decades. So yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, if you had sanctuaries in Africa, so they weren't intended to go back to the wild, but there was an area enclosed where they could live their lives out, but in Africa, that might be a possibility, and that may still happen. Who knows? There have been a few Asian elephants, a couple of Asian elephants that have been sent to essentially sanctuaries in Cambodia. There's one, come on.
Yeah.
What's that? But those are not. That's not the wild. That's not rewilding. Those are controlled situations, but they're better than they're like U.S. sanctuaries.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to combine a couple questions. So the question is, what is the name of the association that's in charge of setting standards for zoos, which we talked about earlier in the Zoom, and what sort of data or research do these organizations use to set these standards?
Well, there's two questions there, and I mean in the U.S. and Canada, there is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. I think it's actually called the American Association, but it's only AZA, Associated Zoos Aquarium. In Canada, it's CAZA, and they have standards that, if you read their documents, they have a long preamble. In Britain, there's the British and Irish Zoo Association. In Europe, there's so they've all got AZA, EAZA, BAZA. In Australia, there's they changed the name, but it might be Australian Zoo Association. All quite similar. British ones the standards are quotes higher. Generally, they have a section on the biology of elephants, and then they have the section on their standards, and it's like, so can you not see that they're different? And so the research that describes the biology of elephants is based on what I'm describing, and many other sites have found similar things. The zoo standards are based on what the zoos can afford to do, and they are some membership associations, and their members, for the most part, are urban zoos like Fresno. They don't have very much space. They raise through donors and often government bond issues and things. They raise tens of millions of dollars to build these elephant exhibits, which are still only a few acres in size. And so they're not motivated by research. They're not underpinned by any research. They're just underpinned by what the zoos can afford to do. And over time, the standards have inched upwards. But inch is the important word there. They're not based on what elephants need, only what zoos can afford to do.
I would think, what you brought up, like they do spend tens of millions. Like I think the LA Zoo spent $40 million, redesigning their elephant habitat. Fresno spent, I think, a similar amount. And all of this money they're spending to expand their exhibit could go towards, they could donate it to legitimate conservation efforts, or they could send their elephants to a sanctuary and donate that money to the sanctuaries that will be providing them refuge for the remainder of their lives. There's a way for them to help solve the problem that they've created instead of just, giving maybe the elephants an acre more of space or a little bit more grass. That's, if you think of all the zoos and, just how much money they're spending, like you said, just renovating, like they could help the elephants with that money.
Absolutely. I mean, they could put the money, they could raise the money, put it in a unit trust in a managed fund, and the income from that could support projects that create space for elephants in Africa over tens of thousands of square. There's a project around Amboseli that is working with rural communities and doing anti-poaching, and they have a budget of about $3 million a year. This is called Big Life Foundation, and $3 million a year. That the income from $50 million or $10 million, if it's managed properly, could keep that project going forever. And there are 2,000 elephants in Amboseli, so the math's, it's pretty simple.
Yeah. Mickey, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, let me see. There's a lot of questions around zoos. So I might have to try and combine everyone's questions. I'm so sorry. This was just so interesting. Everyone has so many good questions. So let me see. Okay, so what, Keith, in your opinion, is something that we can do to change the mindset of the public in terms of attending zoos, keeping these zoos open? What is something we can do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I've seen a lot of advocacy effort going into demonstrating outside zoos and such things, and I don't know how effective that is, and I don't think that anyone has tried to assess the effectiveness of it. I mean, one of the things that I did in my career was to do project evaluation of conservation projects, and it would always involve looking at the objectives and then seeing whether in the course of time those objectives have been met, and what project efforts had contributed toward those objectives. And I think that the advocacy sector needs to kind of do that, take a look at what has been effective. What has been most effective has been lobbying governments at the local level. I've had the work I did in Japan was supported by Zoo Check Canada, along with, as you mentioned, Yularo Nakagawa raised funds as well, and it's a partnership between them. And I also worked at the Toronto elephants that came to pause, were also worked on by Zoo Check, and their approach is to work with politicians, to lobby, to find a way to work with amenable politicians. So writing to your council members, and in a measured way, but trying to sound them out and finding out if which council members in a city council are open for turning, if you like, open to listening. I think the confrontational approach only causes people to dig in, but I think if you can get facts to people and convince them to support to your viewpoint, then they can put pressure on the city council. In the case of LA, there were attempts to do that. It was successful in Toronto. I know the AZA is trying to fight a rearguard action against that. But that is, I think, the most effective way to do it, and working from grassroots. And then if, in a state like California, and I think this is where the Non-Human Rights Project is doing its work. It's not working with elected officials, it's working with the legal system, appointed judges, and trying to sound out judges and looking for places where legal opinions might be open to accepting some of these issues. Once they're established, once the precedent is established, then a lot will follow that, a lot of change will follow that. And I think a state like California, very often people say, well, you know, California, what California does, you know, one year, the US does a few years later, you know, on the national stage. You wish, in many cases, but it's certainly true. And the example is the bullwhip ban. People fought circuses for years and years, trying to get them to stop the cruelty to elephants. But when people worked out that the general public hated the idea of hooks being coercive control of elephants, and council members were convinced to ban that, ban their use in a city.
Mhm.
That led to circuses couldn't operate without the bullhook. That city, state, bang, circuses stop. So I think that's what I would say. Work on the levers of change, politicians and the judiciary.
Yeah, and I think with the bullhook, like you brought up a good point. I think raising awareness, you know, zoos, a lot of people look at zoos as the experts in animals. And I think, you know, bringing people like you and, you know, Joyce Poole, Cynthia Moss, you know, those who have studied elephants and know about what their needs are, and really making the public aware about how zoos fail to meet those needs in a very sort of upfront, not antagonistic way. Is really important as well. And something I'll share with what we are going to be sharing soon is we have photos of inside the Fresno Zoo elephant exhibit, and you can see there are wires out of the natural rocks around the trees that you can't really see up close. Like you have to focus in with like a high lens camera to see what zoos do, so that you can't see like the little, I don't want to call them tricks, but they are sort of tricks they're playing on the public, thinking that, oh, the elephants can rub up against these rocks or they can pull from these trees, when in reality they're wrapped in wire or there's sharp things in there preventing them from doing that. So I think raising awareness about the problems with the zoos, and just, you know, really informing the public about why elephants need to be sent, should not be in zoos in the first place, and those that are currently in zoos need to be sent to a sanctuary where they can, you know, thrive.
Right.
So I think we're at the end. Thank you so much, everyone who tuned in. If there are other questions you have for Keith or myself, feel free to email them to Mickey, and we'll bug Keith again and see if he can provide some responses. We'll send a follow-up email. And then soon we'll be posting the photos from the Fresno Zoo, so you can get a better idea of what the exhibit actually is like. So I wanted to, again, thank you so much, Keith, for all that you've done for elephants, for all that you're doing for our clients at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo, and for taking the time to speak with us today about your work, about the needs of elephants, and how we can help.
It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just popped in my email address in the chat. So like Courtney said, if anyone has any questions for the NhRP or for Keith, please send them to me and we'll do our best to get those answers to you. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Dr. Keith Lindsay.
Bye.
Pleasure's mine. Bye.
Bye.